So what better way to start off 2022 than with my long-awaited Bait Finesse Reel Arsenal video that I promised to make. Now I've actually had to re-record this intro because while I was filming all the reels, it was leaked that Shimano is indeed coming out with a new Aldebaran BFS this year, which I believe is scheduled to be released in April. So just an FYI, some of the things I say in this video won't reflect that. Now, this is a video of all the current BFS reels that I own, minus a couple that I will reveal to you guys later. And the way I did it is in chronological order from the oldest to the newest. So grab some snacks and a drink because this is going to be a long one. Now obviously the first reel we're going to start off with is the oldest Bait Finesse reel that I have. And it's the reel I've had the longest, and that is the 2012 Shimano Aldebaran BFS XG. Now this is a historically significant reel for Shimano, as it's their first ever official Bait Finesse reel that used the BFS acronym. And it's actually the first ever low profile BFS reel for Shimano as well, because the other two previous reels that I would consider Bait Finesse for Shimano were the Cardiff 50 DC and the Calcutta Conquest 50 Shallow Spool Special, and both of those reels were round. Since this reel is 10 years old, it's got a pretty heavy spool by today's standards at 9.5 grams without its bearing, and the spool is pretty deep by today's Bait Finesse standards as well. Now this is a pretty interesting Bait Finesse reel, and let me show you why. Now obviously the handle and knobs are not standard. There was a point where I was going to tune this reel out, and I still might, but if you take a look at this reel, it's very unusual looking, and that's because Shimano heavily modified their current Aldebaran platform at the time into this Aldebaran BFS. And what they did was they gave it the Core fit body, and if you take a look at this reel, it's very flat on one side. And if you compare it with the frame that it's based on, for example, this CURADO 50, you can see the size difference there. It's much flatter on the palm side for the Aldebaran BFS, and they did this for a reason. They wanted to bring the handle closer to the frame, and they also gave it a very large 6-point drag star. And the reason they did this was because they wanted you to be able to just with one hand reach over and flick that drag star and just, move your bait along the bottom that way. Now if you look over here where the spool tension knob is supposed to be, that's actually not a spool tension knob. That's just a decorative cap. The spool tension knob was moved over to the palm side plate, and that's this red dial here. Now you would think it'd be hard to get to, and it might be if you have large fingers, but with my, average size fingers, I still can turn this spool tension knob. But that's not an externally adjustable, brake knob in the conventional sense. Now another cool feature is that you see they use this little plate. Now Shimano was the first company that implemented this, and it's a design that KASTKING copied with their Royal Legend Elite. But to open up the side plate, you just twist it like that, pull off the side plate, and let's check out this other little feature of this reel. It uses a modified version of Shimano's old VBS or SBS brakes. Now usually at the time in their other reels they used 6 brake shoes, but you can see with this Aldebaran BFS they went with 8, and these shoes are smaller than the average Shimano brake shoe that uses this design. So you got a total of 8 adjustments there, but still no external adjustment to be found. Now the pros for the Aldebaran BFS is that it's very lightweight and small, super comfortable to palm, and it's still probably Shimano's smallest ever low profile baitcaster frame. Now since it's made of magnesium, it was very lightweight, coming in at the low 5-ounce range. Now the cons for this reel are that the spool to frame tolerance was not very good. I remember even 6-pound line sometimes getting caught between the spool and the frame. The spool tension needed readjusting very often, and that's if you use, a tighter spool tension. So after several casts, you'll notice that the spool would start overrunning, and I found out that's because the spool tension would somehow work its way loose and you'd have to constantly readjust it and retighten it. Now, as far as performance goes, I would say that this spool out of the box will get you down to 2 grams comfortably if you use the right rod and line, of course. But yeah, the 2012 Aldebaran BFS, this reel, as well as the Abu Garcia Rivo LTX, which is a reel I don't have anymore, were the 2 reels that I pretty much learned how to bait finesse fish on, finding out the limits on what you can or can't do with BFS. So next up is the Daiwa SS Air that came out in 2014. And this is still one of my favorite reels. Now, the SS Air has a empty spool weight of 6.8 grams. So still very acceptable in 2022. And the distinguishing feature, I guess, about the SS Air is that it was basically a first generation STEEZ turned into a bait finesse reel. But then you threw in the exact same spool that you got from the ultra expensive Daiwa T3 Air. So basically what that means is everything on this reel is super smooth and super precise. All the functions on it, whether you're pressing a thumb bar, turning the handle, cranking the drag star, and particularly it's got the most precise clicking spool tension that I've ever felt, and it's yet to be matched. And this is probably because it is basically a STEEZ that's been converted into a bait finesse reel, and the STEEZ is known as an ultra refined reel. Now, the only negatives I find on this reel are that the size is much bigger than current bait finesse offerings, but it's still very lightweight at about 5.3 ounces. And the only other thing that I would say is that this reel is a beast when it comes to casting ultralight lures, but when you get up into the upper end bait finesse, let's say 3 grams and up, it struggles against its competition, and that's probably due to its air brake rotor. But with that being said, with the right rod and line, I would say this SS Air is probably good for lures down to at least 1.5 grams, possibly even lower than that. But the funny thing is, I've never really even tested the lower limits on this reel, but I'm pretty sure it'll surprise me if I did. So once again, the 2014 Daiwa SS Air. So next up is going to be the 2015 Shimano Aldebaran BFS XG Limited. Now, this reel is basically a tuned version of the 2012 model, and it's kind of like the last hurrah for this platform. So Shimano, I guess, threw all of their best BFS technology they had at the time into this reel. And the differences between this reel and the 2012 version are it got a much more attractive, glossy, deep black paint job. It's sporting a lighter and shallower, more attractive red spool that comes in at 9 grams. Shimano outfitted it with their current finesse knob and handle assembly that they use in all of their current BFS reels today. And they actually gave this reel micro bearings for the spool, while the 2012 version had standard bearings. Now, this reel had all the same issues that the 2012 version had. The spool to frame tolerance wasn't that great, and the spool tension often worked itself loose, just like the 2012 version. But this thing casts like a beast. In fact, I did a, 7-way bait finesse shootout several years ago on my channel, and this reel destroyed all the other reels. And we're talking current BFS reels like the 2016 Aldebaran BFS, the Scorpion BFS, Conquest BFS, and Daiwa SS Air. And I would say with the right rod and line, you can probably go down to about a 1/16 of an ounce comfortably with this reel. The only drawback is that the brakes are not fine tunable, which will hold it back with the super lightweight stuff. So next up is going to be the 2016 Abu Garcia Rivo LTX BF8. Now, this is the 2nd generation LTX bait finesse reel from Abu Garcia, and I hope there's going to be a 3rd. Now, this reel has a lot going for it. I believe it's tied with the Revo MG Extreme 2, which is based off of as the lightest reel in the world, coming in at about 4.5 ounces. The reel came with a lot of extras that its competition doesn't give you, like extra flat knobs in case you prefer those over the smaller round knobs. It came with different color nut retainers for customization, and it's the first reel that I know of that came with a carbon fiber drag star as stock. Now personally, I think this is the most refined and smoothest Abu Garcia Rivo that I've ever owned or handled. It doesn't have that geary feeling that you get from other Rivos, and the thumb bar is very smooth and crisp in its actuation, and there's no mush or play in it. Now the spool on the LTX BF8 comes in at 6 grams even, which for the longest time was the lightest stock bait finesse spool in the world. But unfortunately, it's time to talk about the one big weakness and con of this reel, and that is the brake system. Now the brake system is the Magtrax 3 static system, so that means it's very adjustable in the fact that you can remove and configure magnets on one side of the magnet bank. But even with all magnets installed, this is the closest thing to a JDM BFS reel with weak brakes. I literally can only adjust the reel maybe 4 or 5 clicks from its maximum position, and anything lower than that, no matter the weight of the lure, the spool will backlash. And because of that, the brakes are very finicky. So this reel is very frustrating even if there's a slight wind. But if the conditions were perfectly calm and still, the LTX BF8 would outcast its competition. Now because it's got such a light spool, I would say this reel could probably cast down to 1 gram with no problem, with the right rod and line of course. Now since this reel is going on 6 years old, I hope Abu Garcia has another next generation LTX waiting in the wings to be released very soon. So next up is a reel that needs no introduction, and that of course is the 2016 Shimano Aldebaran BFS. And it's my current favorite bait finesse reel. And the reason for that is that its biggest strength is that it has no weaknesses. Now yes, the spool is heavy by today's standards at 7.2 grams, and I actually removed the spool bearing to get that picture to show you that it is actually 7.2 grams. But because it comes with the best purely magnetic braking system in the world, Shimano's FTB, it casts lures like a reel that has a much lighter spool. Now one thing that carried over from the previous generation Shimano BFS reels is the oversized 6-pointed drag star, but it's not quite as compact as the previous Aldebaran BFSs, so reaching over with your finger to turn the handle with the drag star isn't quite as easy. Now with the right rod and line, I would say the lower comfortable fishable limit for this reel is going to be about 1.3 grams. Now it can cast lower, but you're really going to suffer with castability and accuracy, as I've shown in previous videos where I cast a 1 gram trout magnet. Now I like this reel so much I actually bought 2, and I hate buying 2 of the same reel. The only time I like to buy a reel that's the same as one I already have is if the previous reel is lost or broken beyond repair. But this year a lot of people are predicting a new Aldebaran BFS will come out, and we're going to find out in just a couple of short weeks when the Japanese fishing shows take place. So next up is going to be the 2017 Shimano Scorpion BFS. And unfortunately for this reel, it's overshadowed by the Aldebaran and the next reel I'm going to talk about. But before the SLX BFS and CURADO BFS came out, this was the cheapest Shimano bait finesse reel you could get. And basically it's a lower spec Aldebaran. So that means it's got an aluminum frame, so that makes it heavier. The spool comes in at 8.8 grams, which by today's standards is really heavy. But since it comes with Shimano's FTB system, it casts like a spool that weighs about a gram lighter. Now it also comes with a clicking drag system, and I would say this reel is good for lures down to about 1.7 grams or about a 1/16 ounce, of course with the right rod and line. Now the thing about this reel is that I'm not even sure if they are for sale anymore brand new, because they've come out with the SLX BFS and the CURADO BFS which are basically the same reel as the Scorpion, with just very minor differences. But I still think this Scorpion BFS is a top performing bait finesse reel, especially for the price. And its only weakness really is the fact that Shimano purposely gave it that heavier spool to separate it from their more expensive BFS offerings. But if you're throwing, 1/16 ounce and up, it's awesome. So next up is going to be probably, I would say, one of the most important reels in bait finesse history, and that is the Soranoya XF50. Now, I'm not sure when this reel came out, probably sometime in 2017, but it was the first reel that made bait finesse affordable to everybody. Now, I know Shimano, Daiwa, Abu Garcia have their own budget BFS reels, but those reels are still way more expensive in comparison to this reel, which at the time you can buy for about 60 bucks on AliExpress. Now, I'm not sure if they're being sold today or not, but this reel is a solid performing BFS reel, even by today's standards. Now, it does have a really heavy spool at 11.4 grams. That's also pretty deep as well by today's BFS standards. But there are ways to get around that limitation, like using maybe half a spool of line instead of filling it all the way up. But I would say this reel is good for lures down to about 2.5 grams with the right rod and line, of course. Now, there are a couple of cons for this reel, but I don't really consider them cons given the price. Now, the first con, of course, is that much heavier spool, but once again, this reel is going on 5 years old. But the second con is that the build quality felt kind of cheap and plasticky. There's a lot of creaks and noises coming out of the reel, and also the handle and knob assembly is really heavy, and it makes the reel feel unbalanced. Now, I've never heard of an XF50 failing out in the field or out on the water, and there's a channel called BCSG Fishing. He doesn't post anymore, but he gave a long-term review on this reel, and he caught some really big fish, I think including some pretty decent peacock bass, and the reel held up just fine. But yeah, the XF50 is probably the reel responsible for the big surge in popularity of bait finesse. Now, next up is an anomaly in the bait finesse world, and that is a 2017 Shimano Calcutta Conquest BFS, which is Shimano's top-of-the-line bait finesse reel, at least as far as price is concerned. Now, basically, Shimano took a 2014 Calcutta Conquest 100, modified the frame for a 32mm BFS spool, slapped on the BFS handle and knob assembly, installed a drag clicker, and colored it silver instead of gold. So basically that means this is an all metal tank of a reel that's seriously over-engineered for bait finesse fishing duties, but that's just how Shimano rolls when it comes to their top-of-the-line reels. Now, despite being an all-metal reel, it is very small for a round reel, so it comes in at, I think, 7.1 ounces. Heavy for the bait finesse world, but pretty light when it comes to bait casters in general. Now, the spool comes in slightly heavier than the Aldebaran at about 7.3 grams. And yes, I removed the spool bearing for the Conquest to get that spool weight. But I find that when it comes to casting performance, it is neck and neck with the Aldebaran. But the main difference between this and the Aldebaran, other than, frame material and shape and weight, is that the Conquest comes with Shimano's top-of-the-line first-level micro-module gears. Now, the smoothest bait finesse reel I owned up until I got the Conquest, and this still holds true today, was the Daiwa SS Air. But when you combine those first level micro module gears and put them into an all aluminum round reel, the smoothness and refinement on this reel is definitely a notch above the SS Air. When you turn the handle, it feels like it has no gear teeth at all. Now, the only con I can think of is that the reel is pretty expensive at close to $400, but it is built to last a lifetime. Now, because it has the same brakes and pretty much the same spool weight as the Aldebaran BFS, I would say this reel will comfortably cast down to about 1.3 grams on a full spool, of course with the right rod and line. Now, if I lost my Conquest BFS tomorrow, would I hop online immediately and buy another one? And the answer is probably going to be no. and not because of anything that the Conquest BFS does bad, because it does everything well, but I just prefer the lighter, lower profile models like the Aldebaran. But do I regret buying the Conquest BFS? And the answer is going to be no. I wanted to see what a round BFS reel would feel like, and I definitely don't regret my purchase. So this brings us to the infamous Haibo STEED. Now the STEED came out probably around the same time as the XF50, so probably around 2017 or somewhere about that time. Now on paper, the STEED was far superior to the XF50, even though they sold for about the same price. Now that's because the reel was smaller and lighter, it palmed better, it had an aluminum frame versus graphite, it had a much lighter spool at 8.5 grams that was much shallower as well, and just overall it looked like a much better looking reel to me than the XF50. It even came with extras like hybrid ceramic spool bearings if you wanted to stick them in, and extra magnets, kind of like the Rivo LTX BF8. But unfortunately all of that did not matter because the brakes are so weak on this reel that it made the reel pretty much, in my opinion, unfishable. And that's even with installing all the magnets, which by the way you had to super glue to keep them in place. Now the only way to even make the reel fishable was to turn the brakes up to maximum and lock down that spool tension so tight that you really had to whip that cast to even get the lure out there. And on my particular reel, the thumb bar came completely off while fishing. Now the weak brakes and unfishability is not limited to just my reel, because I actually bought two of these reels, one for me and one for my cousin, and both reels behave the exact same way. So if they're still even for sale on AliExpress, I would avoid this reel at all costs. Which is a shame though, because I really love the way it looks and it gave you so much for your money. But of course all that doesn't matter if the reel is unusable. So next up is a reel that is what I would consider another landmark reel, probably up there with the XF50 when it comes to significance, and that of course is the Fishman GH100. Now this reel came out in either late 2018 or early 2019, and it made a huge buzz in the bait finesse world, and that's because it tried to mimic Shimano's Aldebaran BFS right down to its dynamic FTB brake system. So because of that, despite having a pretty heavy spool by today's bait finesse standards at 8.4 grams, the brake system allowed it to keep up with a lot of the lighter spooled reels that would come out soon after this reel. Now the significance of this reel was that it costs about $60, or roughly the same as the XF50, so that made it very accessible to anyone wanting to dip their toe into bait finesse. But the difference between the GH100 and the XF50 is that the XF50 couldn't keep up when it came to casting compared to JDM reels, even the budget JDM reels. Now with the GH100, this reel could keep up and even surpass a lot of the JDM reels except for the most expensive top tier ones. So it gave people JDM BFS performance at an AliExpress price. And I'll have to say that the build quality on my particular reel is excellent. It feels solid even for being such a lightweight reel made out of graphite or carbon. And I would say that the lowest lure this reel could comfortably fish is probably down to 2 grams, of course with the right rod and line. Now this reel has of course recently been surpassed by a lot of the new generation AliExpress BFS reels, but even today it is a solid performing reel and a great first bait finesse reel for anyone who is wanting to dip their toe into this genre of fishing, because the brakes are very, very forgiving. So next up is going to be the Soranoya Spirit Fox. Now this reel came out in 2019, shortly after the GH100, and basically what this reel is an updated XF50. So that means they're using pretty much the same frame and side plates. Of course the top of the frame is a little bit different than the XF50, but in my opinion it feels better made, like the internal tolerances are better than the XF50. Now the most important thing though is that they gave it a much shallower, much lighter spool that comes in at 7.8 grams. But they retained that awesome braking system from the XF50. Some other changes are that they went with a carbon fiber handle and much lighter rubber knobs that shaved about probably an ounce off of the weight of the XF50 with this Spirit Fox. And what can I say, this reel is just a solid performer even by today's standards. And just like the GH100, this thing was priced at about $60, but it gave you the ability to have Japanese or JDM level BFS reel casting performance at a much cheaper price. Now the cool thing about the Spirit Fox was that it came in all sorts of different colors as well, like this seafoam green or blue. It came in red, I think black, and some kind of a purpley rainbow color. So there were quite a few options. Now I'm not sure if it's still for sale today, but as I said before, it's a solid performer, and I would say that this thing can cast down to probably a 16th ounce comfortably, of course with the right rod and line. It actually handles a 16th ounce lure better than the GH100. So next up is going to be the Fishband PW100. Now this reel came out in mid to late 2019, and it's basically one of the reels that uses the same side plates and frame as the XF50 and the Spirit Fox, with just some subtle differences in the front of the frame. So pretty much everything else was the same, including the spool, which comes in at 7.8 grams. It's got the same powerful braking system, thankfully, but there was something about this spool that made it significantly lighter than the Spirit Fox, which came in I think at about 5.7 or 5.8 ounces, as this is the first AliExpress BFS reel, or probably even the first AliExpress reel that came in at under 5 ounces. Now since the spool did come in at 7.8 grams, casting was pretty much identical to the Spirit Fox, so you could go down to 1/16 pretty comfortably. But soon after, they actually came out with a Pro model that gave you a much lighter spool, as well as some more finesse oriented metal knobs, and I believe a drag clicker. Now I didn't get that model, but I did end up buying that purple spool, as I was going to do a video on upgrading one of these reels, but I'm not even sure if the PW100 is still for sale anymore. But it is a solid overall reel, and if it is still for sale, I could definitely recommend it, especially if you're looking for an ultralight reel. So next up is going to be one of the prettiest reels that I have, but it's not very well known, and that is the KR Phantom. Now this reel came out in late 2019, so as you can see, a ton of BFS reels came out on AliExpress in 2019. Now this reel is one of several reels on AliExpress that use the same frame and side plate tooling as the Fishman GH100. And in fact, this reel is the same reel as the GH100 with a few differences. Now the first being the rainbow coating on the side plates, and they also gave it a longer handle with different knobs, and I believe they changed the gearing inside to brass, so this reel is actually significantly heavier than the GH100. But the good news is that like the GH100, it came with the imitation Shimano FTB dynamic brake system, and on the scale, that pretty purple spool actually weighed a little bit less than the GH100 spool at 8.2 grams. Now performance wise, this thing was pretty awesome, just like the GH100. In fact, I took it out onto the casting field to do a cast battle against the Abu Garcia Rivo EXD with a shallow spool, and I think it was well on its way to winning that battle up until the only flaw in this reel reared its ugly head. And that flaw is that I guess the molds for the GH100 frame and side plates have been used so much that the tolerances have worn down, because the spool to frame tolerance on the palm side plate is horrible. So if you get an overrun or backlash this reel and you're using 4 or even 6 pound line, there's a good chance that that line is going to get caught up between the spool and the frame. And because of the design of the brake system, most of the time that line will wrap around it. So you'll have to pull the side plate off and unwind the line from around the brake hub. Now I did fish this reel once or twice and I was pretty impressed with the casting performance, but I did turn the brakes up higher than I would normally go to keep it from overrunning or potentially backlashing. I think the Phantom can go down to about 1/16 of an ounce using the right rod and line, of course. But I think it's a moot point because I don't think this reel is available on AliExpress anymore. So the next reel is going to be the Mavlos Pioneer GBC 200. I think this reel came out in late 2019, probably sooner than that, because I remember looking at this reel on AliExpress for the longest time before I bought it. And the reason I bought it was because at the time it only costed me about $30. So that makes this the cheapest bait finesse reel I've ever purchased up until recently, and you guys are gonna have to wait to see what I mean by that statement. So for $30, what do you get? Well, first of all, there's no denying you get a really good looking reel. It's got that deep, shiny, gloss black paint job set off by those light blue accents. And you actually get a pretty decently lightweight spool for 30 bucks as well, as the Pioneer spool weighed in at about 7.6 grams. But unfortunately, that lightweight spool was ruined by extremely weak brakes and the fact that, at least on my particular reel, it took a pair of pliers to turn that spool tension knob. So even for $30, I would consider this reel a fail. And I've actually tried to fix the brakes as well by using that same magnet kit that I used on the Hibo STEED. And it really didn't make that big of a difference or make it worth the hassle, especially when you have to put up with that extremely hard to turn spool tension knob. Now if you want to see my ordeal with this reel, look for this thumbnail in my video list and check that out. Now I think the Pioneer has several different variants for sale on AliExpress, and I think the latest one is called the Kingdom Microfly. And Jimmy over at Roar Fishing actually bought that reel and did some testing, and it looks to me like the brakes even on that reel still suck, just like on the Pioneer, which is unfortunate because that reel costs a lot more than $30. So if you see this reel on AliExpress still for sale, I would definitely avoid it because you're basically just throwing $30 into the trash can. So moving right along, we're almost halfway done, but the next reel is going to be the 2020 Abu Garcia Rivo Ultracast BF8. Now this is a reel that I really didn't need, as it had no technology or specs that were really popping out to me, but it was a reel that I wanted instead of needed. And the sole reason why I bought the reel was for this awesome chameleon paint job, which I believe is the same paint job that you'll find on the Rivo Ike. Now the Ultracast BF8 is basically a budget saltwater BFS reel that uses the same frame and platform as the LTX BF8, but it's kind of been beefed up for saltwater. So it's got the sealed corrosion resistant bearings, I believe it's using brass gears instead of aluminum, and it's got a more robust, longer aluminum handle versus carbon fiber. Now the spool on this reel is actually very heavy by even bait finesse standards 10 years ago, coming in at 10 grams without the bearing. Now the reason for that is that I believe the spool walls are thicker and they're using a stainless steel spool shaft instead of aluminum like they do on the LTX. Now this is of course due to the fact that it is made for inshore saltwater use. Now unfortunately I didn't do a casting impressions video of this reel like I wanted to, but I did take it down to Florida to do some actual saltwater fishing in Tampa Bay. And while I didn't catch anything of size, I did catch a couple of little, I guess what you would call pinfish, but I can report that the Rivo Ultracast brakes are much stronger than that on the LTX, as I was fishing in extremely windy conditions, but I had zero issues with this reel. Now granted, I wasn't throwing the lightest of lures. I think I was throwing like a Lucky Craft Pointer 65, which is about 5 grams, but the brakes are plenty powerful enough. But I didn't really test the lower limits on this spool and what it could cast. So I would probably say you could drop down to about 2.5 grams with this reel using the appropriate rod and line, of course. And maybe one day I'll test that theory. But this reel is still available for sale today. It's right around $200. And the good news is that any spool that'll fit into the LTX will fit into this spool. So the next reel is another reel that needs no introduction, and that is the 2020 Daiwa SS Air TW. Now this reel, along with the STEEZ Air, represents the next generation in Daiwa bait finesse. So compared to the previous SS Air, the frame is much smaller and more comfortable to palm, despite including the bigger T-wing line guide. Now the big thing about the SS Air TW as well as the STEEZ Air was that Daiwa Japan was claiming that with the new smaller spool technology that they used, it allows you to easily cast down to 1 gram comfortably, and the key word is comfortably. So as soon as I got my reel, I went out to a pond and I tested that theory, and even though I didn't fill the spool all the way full, the SS Air casted a 1 gram trout magnet a good fishable distance, but more importantly, it did it easily and with good accuracy. Now the spool weight itself wasn't the lightest, but at the time it was probably the second lightest, coming in at about 6.2 grams, just behind the Rivo LTX BF8. But the size of the spool is, in my opinion, the biggest factor in this reel being able to comfortably cast that 1 gram trout magnet. Now it's got a 28mm spool. Now while spools under 30mm are nothing new, I don't think they've gone down quite as small as 28mm. Now I know everyone has been waiting for the comparison between the SS Air and the current Aldebaran BFS, and I know you guys are wanting to see it from me, but I've been holding off on doing that on purpose because I wanted to see what Shimano was introducing this year at the Japanese fishing shows, because they could be coming out with the new Aldebaran BFS. So if they don't, then you're going to see me do a very detailed comparison between this reel and the 2016 Aldebaran. So next up is the only other round BFS reel in my arsenal, and that is the $40 JKS Sabre 50. And it's actually built surprisingly well for a $40 reel that has aluminum side plates but what they call a nylon frame. Now I bought this reel purely out of curiosity, and it's kind of a mix between a modern round reel and a vintage round reel in the fact that it does have a modern clutch and thumb bar, but in order to access the spool you have to pretty much unscrew the side plates from the frame like an old round reel. So because of that, I can't give you a definite weight on the spool, but I've seen another YouTuber weigh it and I think it comes in at around 11 grams. So that is very, very heavy, even by bait finesse standards 10 years ago. But I think the spool is probably smaller in diameter than the average BFS spool today, probably somewhere around 30mm or less. But unfortunately I can report that the brakes on this reel are very weak. And being a $40 reel, it's not built too well as far as tolerances go. But the good news is, due to the design of this reel, I believe they put some small metal plates on the end of the spool tension knob, so you can actually tighten up the spool tension on this reel and make it fishable, and cast pretty lightweight lures as well, which really surprised me. Now I did a whole video on this reel if you want to go check that out, including some casting, and I think I went down probably as low as maybe a 1/16 ounce, I can't remember, but go check that video out if you want to see what the Sabre JK50 can do. Now being a $40 reel is not that big a hit on the wallet, but if you're looking for your first bait finesse reel, I wouldn't recommend this one. I would only recommend it as, I guess, a novelty item, or if you're just a die-hard round reel fan. So next up is going to be the Mavvelos Athlon. And as you can see, this is sporting a different kind of rainbow paint job than you'll normally see. It's more of a green turquoise versus a purple and blue. Now this reel was actually sent to me by Mavlos. I didn't purchase it, and I guess it was to make up for their horrible Pioneer. Now the Athlon is not a purpose-built bait finesse reel. It's one of those reels that you'll find on AliExpress that come with two spools, a standard deep spool and an extra shallow BFS spool. Now as far as the BFS spool, it weighs about 9.6 grams, so a little heavy for my tastes, but I'll say that it's probably good down to about 2.5 grams. Now at the time I made the video on the Athlon, I think the reel was around $45, and it's actually a really good reel. It feels solid, well made, and that's probably because it is heavier than most of the reels you'll find on AliExpress. So as a first beginner bait finesse reel, if it's still available for sale, I would highly recommend it because first of all, it's affordable and it comes with the standard deep spool as well. So the next reel I acquired was the KASTKING Zephyr. And this reel is probably the best-selling bait finesse reel in the world. And that's because of several reasons. Now the first reason is that it is a very good looking reel, very distinctive. As you can see, it's got the nice shiny black paint job. But instead of going with the usual red spool and accents, they went with a nice bright orange, so it's very distinctive. Now the second reason is that it is a KASTKING, and while some of you guys may hate it, KASTKING is a mainstream brand now. And the third reason is that it's very affordable, making it the perfect first bait finesse reel for anyone wanting to dip their toe into the genre without spending too much money. Now I consider the Zephyr the last of, I guess, the second wave of bait finesse reels from AliExpress. So that means it sports a very similar spool weight to a lot of its competition, coming in at 7.7 grams. So because of that spool weight, the Zephyr can go down to 1/16 of an ounce or about 1.7 grams with the right rod and line, of course. So next up is going to be the JDM Abu Garcia LX992Z. Now this reel is basically a factory tuned version of their cheapest bait finesse reel, the Roxani BF8. And basically what they did was they upgraded the handle and knobs, the spool bearings, gave it some cosmetic enhancements, gave it the MagTrax 3 braking system, and also gave it two spools. You have a deeper versatile finesse spool, and then you have this gold spool that's shallower and holds less line. Now the gold spool weighs in at about 8.4 grams, or just a little bit under. So by today's standards, that's pretty heavy, and I'd say the spool is good for lures down to 2 grams. Now this reel is a follow-up to the previous Rivo LTZ AE74, which was tuned by one of the most famous, I guess, pro-Japanese bass fishermen, so it's not cheap. It came in at almost $400. Now I fished it a couple of times, and while there were no problems with the reel, personally I wouldn't buy another one. For one thing, the spool should have been a lot lighter. This is definitely a bass fishing BFS reel. And secondly, it doesn't look special enough. But as a reel, it does everything that it needs to do. It casts light lures and its brakes are strong enough. But if I had to pick between this and the LTX BF8, I would choose the LTX BF8 all day long. So next up is going to be the Fishman Clamber Hyper Micro, a reel that I consider to be the first in the current generation of bait finesse reels from AliExpress, and also the first reel I believe that was designed to take on the best Japanese JDM reels. And after putting it up against a couple of $300 JDM reels, they hit their mark. Now the Clamber shares the same frame as the ZPI Alcance JDM reel, and the specs on this reel are absolutely top notch for a Chinese reel, as it comes with an aluminum frame, which is rare for any reel coming from China. Everything on it clicks. Comes with a carbon fiber handle and finesse oriented knobs. It's got really good looking high quality trim pieces, and it's sporting a lightweight modified spool that comes in at about 6.2 to 6.4 grams. Now the good thing about the Clamber is that you can take it out of the box, string it up with line, and just go fishing, because everything works on this reel and works really well, unlike some of its competition where you have to fool around with extra magnets and whatnot. Now the only cons that I see are that the quality control consistency needs to be better, and the fact that it is significantly more expensive than its rivals. But then again, you do get that aluminum frame. Now I've successfully fished the clamber down to 1.5 grams, and it can probably even go lower than that, probably even casting a trout magnet if I use the right rod and line. So the next reel is the Shimano CURADO BFS, and basically this reel is a $250 JDM Scorpion BFS with a different paint job, a beefier handle that is more suited for the North American bass market, fractionally heavier spool, and that's pretty much it. Now I was expecting this spool to come in at somewhere around 9 grams, but Shimano USA actually shocked us by giving us a spool that is on the high side of 8.8 grams. So just barely heavier than the more expensive JDM Scorpion. And I think it's actually lighter than the JDM SLX BFS. So that was a plus. Now even though the spool is lighter than I expected it to be, it is still on the heavy side by today's standards. But because it sports the same FTB brake system as the much more expensive Aldebaran and Conquest BFS and Scorpion BFS, it allows the spool to cast down to 1/16 ounce with no problem. Now this is an important bait finesse reel, and that's because it's sporting the CURADO name, and that puts it on the radar of a lot of American bass anglers who normally use spinning reels for finesse fishing. Now only time will tell if American anglers will pay $190 for a BFS reel, but it's still a relative bargain for what you get. Now the only downside to this reel that I see is that it looks too much like all the other CURADOs. I think Shimano should have given it a different color, or at least a much brighter green, to separate itself. But that's just my opinion. So moving right along, we are about 2/3 of the way done, and the next reel is going to be the Shanghai LUT, a reel that copies both Shimano and Daiwa at the same time. Now it's sporting a frame and side plate that is a copy of the current Daiwa STEEZ, but it's also sporting an imitation Shimano FTB dynamic brake system. But in my opinion, it looks way better than both the STEEZ or any Shimano BFS reel out there. And that's because it's sporting a two-tone silver and raw carbon finish, but it's set off perfectly by just the right amount of yellowish gold components, like the drag star, the trim on the gearbox, the spool tension knob, the nut retainer, and the super slim imitation ZPI aluminum knobs. Now the spool on this reel comes in at just under 6.2 grams, so one of the lightest spools you can get from any stock BFS reel at the moment. And if you own a Fishband GH100 or one of its clones that uses the same brake system, you can actually put this spool into your GH100 as a performance upgrade. Now since the spool is so light, I've easily fished this reel with lures down to 1.5 grams with no problem, and I suspect it could probably even throw a trout magnet if I put it on the right rod and use the right line. Now as far as the cons on this reel, I really don't see any. I mean, it's not as small as a lot of its competition, but it foams really nice, so you don't even notice the size. And even though it's slightly more expensive than what you're used to seeing from AliExpress BFS reels, this would be a great first bait finesse reel for anybody. And that's because you're getting a reel that can cast down even to the lightest lures at a fraction of the cost of a reel like, let's say, the Daiwa Alpha Air. So next up is going to be the Kia Rim Black Knight 2. And this is one of the smallest and best looking reels that I've ever bought. And that's due to its rainbow color paint job, of course, that is very similar to the Rivo Ultracast BF8. Now this reel is one of the new generation AliExpress BFS reels, and it is very high spec, as everything on this reel clicks: the spool tension, the drag star, and the drag itself. And it comes with pretty much direct replicas of the knobs that you see on Daiwa's T3 Air and SS Air. Now this reel is also sporting the imitation Shimano FTB system, but the biggest spec on this reel is the smaller and super lightweight spool. Now the spool is coming in at 30 millimeters and it only weighs about 5.5 grams without the bearing. So that spool is lighter than any other spool except for one reel, which we're going to get to here in a second. But the most important thing is that it's lighter than any JDM BFS reel by a long shot. And I've proven on video that this reel can outcast the Daiwa SS Air with the 1 gram trout magnet. Now this is huge considering the cost of this reel, which is around $80. But we have to get to the cons on this reel, and it's a very, very big con. And that is the brake system is very, very weak. And in my experience, while it casts a 1 gram trout magnet with no problem, it struggles with, I guess, regular weight BFS reels. Weights that the average BFS angler would actually be throwing. Now I'm going to be following up with, I guess, some performance tweaks or some brake fixes for this reel in a future video, along with another reel. But as it stands now, I wouldn't recommend this reel, even at its affordable price point. So next up is going to be my most expensive Daiwa bait finesse reel, the Gekabijin Air TWPE Special. Now this reel is an even more focused version of the Alphas, designed for fishing saltwater with braid. Now the cost on this reel is significantly more expensive than the Alphas, but in my opinion, the cosmetic upgrades on it make it worth the money. So you're going to get a nice shiny deep black glossy paint job, and the trim pieces on the gearbox are painted this maroonish red, as well as getting the chrome end caps instead of black. But cosmetic upgrades are not the only thing you're going to get with this reel over the Alphas. Now the first thing is they gave it a different modified spool that's about 0.6 of a gram heavier than the Alpha spool, but they narrowed the channel where you lay the lines, so once both spools are filled with line, the Gekabijin spool is actually lighter than the Alphas by almost 1 gram. And I do believe the Gekabijin spool is sturdier as well, since it is designed to run braid. But the most important thing about this reel is that they've given it a braid tuned rotor that doesn't come out as far as the Alpha's air rotor. So that means less braking, which in my opinion holds back Daiwa's air reels. Now the spool weight without the bearing, it's probably going to be around 6.8 grams. But once again, it holds less line, and I would probably estimate this thing could throw the 1 gram trout magnet with no problem. Now, funnily enough, I haven't even strung this reel up and tested it yet, as I've been too busy, but I do plan on doing a battle between this reel and the Alphas out on the field to test out that braid tune rotor. Now, other than the high cost of this reel, I really find no cons about it, as it actually comes with more ball bearings than the Alphas as well, which is something that I forgot to mention. So that makes it feel a little bit more precise when turning the handle. But be out on the lookout for more videos on this reel soon. So next up is going to be the Soranoya Dark Wolf Ultra. And this reel is a part of the new generation AliExpress BFS reel group. Now this is based on the same frame and platform as the Black Knight 2, so that makes it very high spec. It's got a carbon frame and side plates, carbon handle, carbon knobs that mimic the Daiwa air knobs, and pretty much clicking everything like spool tension, drag star, and drag. Now the thing about this reel is that currently it has the lightest stock bait finesse spool in the world, coming in at only 5.3 grams. So with the right rod and line, I would say it would be able to probably dip slightly under 1 gram. Now because it shares the same platform as the Black Knight 2, it's also going to get the imitation Shimano FTB brakes, but unfortunately, like the Black Knight 2, its brakes are extremely weak. And if you want to see a video of this reel as well as the Black Knight 2 in action, look for the thumbnail I'm posting on the screen for you. The reel doesn't seem to like any kind of lure that's going to generate really high spool speeds. and that's pretty unfortunate because of the potential of such a lightweight spool. And I'm going to be including this reel along with the Black Knight 2 in exploring some possible fixes, but as it stands, I would stay away from this reel, especially if you're a beginner, unless you're willing to fool around with magnets to make the braking stronger. Okay, so this brings us to the last of the stock Bay Finesse reels in my arsenal, and it's probably my most prized as well, and that is the Doyo Liger 30 BFS spec. Now, it's not my most prized BFS reel because it's one of the more expensive ones, or because it's one of the better looking ones, even though that does play into it, but it's my most prized reel due to the fact that, and the only way I came into possession of this reel is because a subscriber and friend of the channel actually lives in South Korea, which I believe is the only place you can buy it. Now, this reel is made of a special graphite that makes it super lightweight, and the shape of it is extremely comfortable to palm. And I spec'd mine out from the factory with these slim aluminum BFS style knobs. And the reason why I wanted this reel was, for one thing, it came with a smaller than average spool diameter of 30 millimeters, but for another thing, it comes with centrifugal brakes. So not only is the reel rare, its braking system is extremely rare in Bay Finesse. Now, speaking of the spool, it comes in at about 7.3 grams. So by today's standard, it's pretty heavy and about 2 grams heavier than the Dark Wolf Ultra. But that braking system, I feel confident, will make up for that weight deficit. Unfortunately, due to weather and time, I haven't been able to take this reel out to test it yet, but I do plan on doing that and sharing the results with you guys. And I probably will do a cast comparison between this reel and the Daiwa Gekabijin Air. So hit the thumbs up button if you guys want to see that. Okay, so the first of the tuned and modified BFS reels is going to be my very first 2016 Shimano Aldebaran. Now remember, I actually have 2 of these reels, and this reel is actually the first one. And I modified this reel to be able to throw the 1 gram trout magnet at least 30 feet with ease of casting and accuracy. And the things I did to do that were swap out the stock spool for an Avail spool. Now, the spool you do see here is not the Avail, it's actually one from AliExpress that's even lighter. I added the extra magnets that you would need for the much shallower spool depth. I upgraded the palm side bearing to a Hedgehog Studios Air BFS bearing. Now, I would have done the spool shaft bearing, but Hedgehog Studios doesn't offer a bearing that small yet. And later on, I added the Avail handle and the Umea knobs. But I was very successful in my quest, as I was able to cast the 1 gram trout magnet with my specialized Kuying Teton rod and 2-pound line almost 50 feet with accuracy. And if you want to see me put this reel together, as well as match it with the specialized rod that I bought and catching fish with a trout magnet, check out my Ultimate BFS playlist. So next up is a reel that most of you guys probably didn't even know I had, and that's because I've never done a video on it, and the reason for that is that the reel itself has been long discontinued, and it's such an awesome reel, it's very hard to even find them used on eBay. Now, this reel is my Shimano Core 50 with an aftermarket Avail shallow spool, and pretty much that's the only thing I did. There are no ceramic hybrid bearings or anything like that. It's just the spool by itself. Now, the spool weighs, I think, about 6.1 grams if I'm not mistaken, and it's using a 4-block version of Shimano's old VBS, and I was actually able to cast a 1 gram trout magnet with this reel, but unfortunately the gap between the frame and the side plate was too big, so literally every time I would overrun or backlash, the line would get caught between the frame and side plates, and pretty much every time it would wrap itself around the brake hub, and it was too much of a pain to dig out, and it was so much of a pain to untangle the line that I pretty much just put the reel back in its box, and it's been sitting there this whole time, and I actually almost forgot I had it. But once again, the awesome Shimano Core 50 with a very expensive aftermarket Avail shallow spool. So next up is a reel that I had probably the best time putting together, and that is the Abu Garcia Rivo X conversion into a bait finesse reel. Now the reason I chose the Rivo X is, for one, it's a very popular selling budget workhorse reel, so that means a lot of people have it. And for two, on AliExpress, there are tons of parts for it. And let me give you guys a brief breakdown on all the things I did to it. Now, I swapped out the handle to a carbon fiber one with these more finesse oriented aluminum knobs. I was actually able to find a nice looking aftermarket nut. I swapped out the spool bearings to the cheap ceramic hybrids. And more importantly, I was able to find a super lightweight spool, at least at the time, that amazingly was very affordable. So all these parts together costed only $48, which is less than half the cost of the reel. If you want to see me put this reel together as well as see the reel in action, look for these two thumbnails in my video list and check that out. But the spool on this reel came in at about 7.3 grams, or almost 7.4, and if you combine that with the excellent braking of the Rivo X as well as the hybrid ceramic bearings, this reel is a bait finesse beast, easily casting down to 1/16 of an ounce, and it could probably go lower with the right rod and line. Now the great thing about this, if you feel so inclined, all these parts will also work on the Abu Garcia Black Max Generation 3. Okay, so we are finally at the end, and this is my last bait finesse reel. A reel that I call the budget poor man's attempt at a Daiwa T3 Air. Now luckily for me, a generous subscriber donated the T3 Ballistic, which is the basis of this reel, and I added a Stream Angler super lightweight super ported aftermarket spool from AliExpress, as well as swapped out the bearings for ceramic hybrid micros, and then I added this aftermarket carbon fiber handle with these metal knobs that resemble the air knobs you'll find on the T3 Air. Now unfortunately, the reel didn't perform as expected, and let me explain why. Now the day after I got my Alpha's Air TW, I took that reel along with the SS Air and this reel out to do a side-by-side cast comparison. Now this poor man's T3 Air did outcast both the SS Air and the Alpha's Air with both 1/8 ounce and 1/16 ounce, but unfortunately, and I blame the spool for this for having such a thin ported out rotor that's also fixed, I could only use the max brake setting and maybe back the brakes off 2 or 3 clicks before the spool would start to explode. Now once again, I don't blame the 3D brake system, as I know it's excellent. I blame the extremely thin and ported out fixed rotor on the spool, which is a shame because I paid so much for it. Now I'm going to attempt to put this spool in other Daiwa reels in the future, but my hopes for it are pretty slim.